The Quatermass experiment began as the Quatermass experiment, the difference being the second one starts with an E. E-Quatermass, as I shall refer to that one to distinguish it from the X-Quatermass, started out thanks to an opening in the BBC's schedule. They needed something to fill in a 6-week gap that was happening in 1953. This was when television was really bursting out from fringe technology into the mainstream. With I Love Lucy a big hit in America, Bob Hope making the leap from radio to television, and a year before Steve Allen would launch The Tonight Show. In the UK, television, having been severely curtailed during World War II, was expanding its reach as well, with BBC expanding to the north of England and then into Scotland, in time for the coronation of Elizabeth II, just a month before E-Quatermass was aired. Nigel Kneale was an interesting entertainment creature. Many actors write in order to get the chance to practice their craft, but Kneale was the reverse. Acting was something to pay the bills while he got to work on his writing career. Once he'd made it, he gave up on acting and pursued script writing, against the advice of publishers who felt that he had the potential to create great novels. But Kneale was fascinated with film and felt that television would better align with the kind of works that he wanted to create. After doing a radio adaptation for the BBC, he was brought over to do general writing for television. But his talents were quickly realized, and in 1952, when Michael Berry became head of drama, he spent the entirety of his budget, £250, having Kneale come work for him. His first job was to help fill out some of the dialogue in an adaptation the BBC was doing, a work directed by Rudolf Cartier, an Austrian Jew who had escaped to America before World War II. When Cartier's career failed to take off in America, he came to Britain and wound up working at the BBC. Berry liked his work, but the dialogue didn't work for him. It felt too German to his ears, hence having Kneale come in to help out. This partnership was extremely important in shaping the BBC's drama department, and despite the occasional heated disagreement, Kneale and Cartier both worked very well together. Like Berry, they saw that BBC's television was barely scratching the surface of what it could do, and the transformation that took place finally made it distinct from both radio and the theater. See, there was a conceit at the time that what made television unique was making the performer up close and personal with the audience, but the result, in Kneale and Cartier's view, was slow and banal, far too confined in its scope. They wanted to have more energy, more space, something that was far from the cozy television that was being done at the time. And they felt the best way to do that would be to use science fiction. SF simply couldn't be done in the cozy style, so they were free to throw away the rulebook and structure their work their way. And this was attractive because serials were more economical than the plays that were being shot, since plays only had one repeat performance on the BBC, but the serials reused elements from the same story over multiple episodes. Remember that at this time, a repeat wasn't a rebroadcast of the original. It was the same as going to the theater. Everyone does the entire thing all over again. Things were still being hashed out with unions representing both the technical side as well as the performers, so the idea in Britain of having recordings of it was met with concerns all around. There was interest in recording them to sell to other countries like Canada for their growing television market, but between the unions and technological limitations, well, things were proving very difficult to resolve. In any event, Kneale had his opportunity, and he thought this would be a great chance to explore science gone wrong using his story. Hence, it would be a blend of both science fiction and horror, and it was marketed around the UK as an exciting thriller. Focused on the efforts of the British Experimental Rocket Group, with the serial named after its head, the famous Professor Quatermass, which Kneale claimed to have picked the name at random from the telephone directory. The evolving tale enraptured audiences, and it was said that on those 6 nights the streets emptied as everyone got home to watch. The final episode's viewers totaled 5 million, more than twice what a typical program on the BBC would get. Quatermass was such a resounding hit that it was singled out in a discussion of what the BBC needed to be doing to remain competitive when it was revealed that there would be competition for television. Sets that had been purchased to see the Queen in June were seen as a worthwhile long-term investment thanks to the enjoyment virtually everyone got from the story. and the anticipatory buzz about the program led to interest in adding it to the list of options for overseas sales. Unfortunately, unlike I Love Lucy in America, which was done on film, the still developing rules prevented that kind of thing, so Quatermass was shot with a standard camera. In fact, the oldest one that the BBC had. To try to keep a recording of it, a kinescope was used, just pointing a film camera at the television. These were all done live, except for what needed to be in pre-recorded 35mm. The result of a primitive recording method using an old camera resulted in a picture quality that was judged not up to rebroadcast standards. So after the first 2 episodes were recorded, the project was abandoned. It wasn't helped that in one of the recordings a bug landed on the screen being filmed and stayed there for some time. So what we had was an incredibly popular science fiction story, with 2/3 of it lost forever, and therefore unlikely for any to see its rebroadcast. But that seemed to only add to the myth around it. It was like attending a world-changing public event. All you'd have in the end were memories of that program that captured everybody's imagination, with the sense of reality infused into the horror. Well, this is where Hammer Film Productions enters our story. Not only had the serial been immensely popular, but the following year saw that science fiction was expanding rapidly in cinemas around the world, from America's Them to Japan's Godzilla. Audiences were flocking to science fiction movies. So cashing in on a boom with a worldwide interest and a strong reputation in the UK itself seemed a sure bet for them. Named after its founder's stage name, William Hines, aka William Hammer, Hammer Studios went bust after 2 years, but was brought back the following year as Hammer Film Productions, connected to a film distribution company called Exclusive. Things were rocky soon after with the interruption of World War II, but in 1947, when the government put a 75% import tax on American films because of concerns that too much money was leaving the country in the post-war years, Exclusive was finding it difficult to find films to distribute in their country. Thus, Hammer was mobilized to begin cranking out films to fill the cinemas. But what were they going to make? They needed things that could be cranked out quickly and on a budget, but would still appeal to audiences. So they approached the BBC. While there was television in the country at that time, it hadn't really arrived just yet. Think of it as the difference between the World Wide Web in 1992 and 1998. It existed, but it hadn't really arrived yet for the majority of the public. So the big deal at the time was still radio, and there was a real opportunity there. People were connected to fictional characters that, by the nature of the medium, they had never seen before. Hammer could bring those characters to life, and so a deal was reached with the BBC to turn their radio plays into films, and it took off. Even after the import tax was canceled the following year, the success of their film series around the character of Dick Barton was magnificent. What was helping Hammer immensely was the involvement of an ex-colonel named Jimmy Carreras, a man with such tremendous people skills, drive, and determination that, and this is supposed to be a true story, he sold to band leader Joe Loss a Buick that did not have an engine, just to prove he could. It was agreed that whatever he would have chosen to go into, he would have excelled at it. He chose Hammer and Exclusive. And while he wasn't a master of making them rich, he was capable, even through those rough years, of keeping the company running smoothly. What he was king of was getting in the door. He wasn't great at brokering deals afterwards, but he could forge connections. So with Hammer already buying radio plays from the BBC, they were in a great position to make an offer for the Quatermass experiment, and it was accepted. Naturally, turning a 6-part serial into a film was going to take work, but what further complicated matters was a little arrangement Carreras had made years earlier. When the import tax had lifted, Exclusive had built up a relationship with American filmmaker Robert Lippert, bringing his low-budget action pictures to the UK. Now, because of the deal worked out between the US and Britain as they hashed out that import tax problem, 20th Century Fox had a lot of money tied up in the UK that it wasn't able to bring back to America, but it could invest it in British films. Thus, Lippert got permission on behalf of Fox to make a deal with Exclusive to co-produce films for Hammer. Lippert's company was actually a shadow company of Fox. The deal was that Lippert hired 2 stars and paid for the script. Hammer would then handle the rest, Exclusive would distribute the film in the UK, and Lippert would distribute the film in the US. The advantage for Hammer itself was that it had access to American actors that it could never have brought over otherwise. And Exclusive had access to the vast American market that all the film companies outside the US were trying to get into. It was for this reason that the titular science, the great Professor Bernard Quatermass, was played by American actor Brian Donlevy. Donlevy, who when he was 14 lied about his age to join the military, had, in keeping with that, gone on to play tough guys, heroes and villains both. And he'd done film and radio. And he'd worked with such greats as Gary Cooper and Clark Gable. But to Neil, he was a has-been. It was bad enough, as far as Neil was concerned, that they were going to take the great British scientist and make him an American, but they went with someone who was past his prime. That didn't sit well at all. But it was felt that Donlevy was needed for this reinterpretation of the story that screenwriter Richard Landau was creating. Neil's original story was a warning against the dangers of mankind tampering in things that it did not fully understand. Now, Landau's American Quatermass was a complete change of message. He was a man who was strong, assertive, and determined. This threat is going to be dealt with because in this post-war world, mankind is ready to face the threats that might come and overcome them. His Quatermass doesn't talk the monster to death. He kills it, and then announces the plan for the next rocket, saddened by the disaster, but determined not to let that stop human progress. Instead of being a warning, the Quatermass experiment was now a reminder of the dangers to be faced, but they would be faced, and they would be defeated. This was an interesting decision, considering that in the wake of this union between Lippert and Exclusive, Hammer's films tended to be far more cynical, featuring villains and even heroes with motivations that were based upon emptiness and a lack of identity, living solely in the moment as a way to temporarily fill the void as they struggled along without purpose. Here now was a horror story carrying the message that we are on the cusp of greatness and will not be denied no matter what the cosmos throws at us. It was a surprising change of direction for Hammer and seemed to show the sea change that was occurring at the studio. Hammer had previously created 3 science fiction films, the most notable being Four-Sided Triangle, an adaptation about a scientist who is involved in a love triangle, and so persuades the target of his affection, Lena, to allow him to duplicate her so he and her duplicate might be together. When the duplicate also falls in love with the same man, they try to electroshock the memories of that man out of her so that he can have his Lena, and Lena won't have any competition for her lover's affections. That film especially foreshadowed the direction that Hammer was heading in, the gothic horror, especially related to the science experiments inspired by Metropolis. The reason that this picture had experiment, no E, was because of British film certification. As I mentioned in The Man Who Changed His Mind, the censorship laws demanded that films be given a rating of H for horrific, meaning that no one under the age of 16 was allowed to see it. This was specifically for horror, but by 1951 they decided to replace that criteria and just give a blanket rating that was unrelated to horror, just a 16 and up rule for all circumstances. This rating was X, but rather than taking that as a worrisome sign like the H had been, Hammer took the X as a badge of pride. And that's why they changed the title, to proudly state they were rated X. That's how scary good their film was. Val Guest, who had already directed several Hammer films, was brought in for X Quatermass, which would be made on a £42,000 budget. Donlevy was obviously sent over by Lippert, and for the other American performer, Margia Dean. There was a bit of discomfort about Dean. The English crew felt that she couldn't act, and in fact she was dubbed in the end, partially for that reason. It wasn't helped that, as anyone not living in a cave for the past few months can tell you, there is a bit of a history in Hollywood of executives using their powers to make actresses sleep with them so that they could have parts. Now, if you check the interviews with the staff on the film and at Hammer, they say that they were told she was sleeping with Skouras, the head of 20th Century Fox at this time, and that it was a favor for him that she was in the film. Well, I did some digging, and Lippert was not only a womanizer, he bragged about it. and Dean was one of his regular conquests. In fact, he apparently had such an obsession with her that he pulled strings with other studios to keep her from getting hired, so she was stuck working and sleeping with him. Skouras, by the way, left the day-to-day operations of 20th Century Fox Productions in the hands of somebody else, and during this time was apparently operating out of New York. Thus, the most likely explanation for all this is that someone from Lippert's studio, possibly Lippert himself, told the English crew that she got the part by sleeping with the boss, but blamed it on a guy who lived on the wrong side of the country to cover up for Lippert. Apparently there was one more monster involved in this movie than anybody knew about. Richard Wordsworth was the choice to play the monster. It was an extremely difficult part to pull off, as Wordsworth not only needed to capture the horror of knowing that he is a monster but not wanting to hurt anyone, but also convey all this without being able to speak. Wordsworth's performance, compared to Boris Karloff's own as Frankenstein, was so good that many feel it made the film, and Wordsworth only failed to continue working with Hammer because he felt that playing a monster once was enough, thus allowing the way clear for Christopher Lee to fill that void at Hammer. Neil's script had been 200 pages. Landau cut it down to 150. Guest cut it down still further, tightening up the dialogue and quickening the pace. He also eliminated Quatermass's final speech at the end of the film, making it a short and simple, "I'm going to start again." The professor of Quatermass has no need to explain himself. His actions make clear what he's doing and why he's doing it. A far cry from the one in Quatermass who, racked with guilt at the doom that he carelessly has brought to the world, pleads with the monster to take him and spare humanity itself. Neil had seen his scientist as a sane mad scientist, if you will, in that he was meddling with things he didn't understand like a mad scientist would, but his humanity makes clear that he's not literally too crazed to not appreciate what has happened. Landau and Guest, on the other hand, saw this as War of the Worlds, an outside invader coming to our world, and only a scientist with nerves of steel could hope to resist this menace. Shot over 5 weeks and enhanced by matte paintings, Quatermass was a genuine hit, described in the press as the best and nastiest horror film I've seen since the war. It was a genuine hit for Hammer, and helped to put them on the path to being synonymous with English horror for decades to come. So, let's take a look at this adaptation of The Quatermass Experiment.